Hello and welcome again to yet another episode of This Week in Christian History. And we are exploring again a very interesting and unique topic to learn about women's missionaries societies. And what in the world was that, particularly of all these American women and other places as well that were all focused on sending out missionaries throughout the world. And we have as our guest today from Indiana Wesleyan University, Dr. Anneke Stasson, who is a professor of the humanities and history there, who is going to take some time to visit with us today. So thank you so much, Dr. Stasson, for doing this.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Well, we are interested to learn about these societies. We actually have used the date of in 1861, whenever one particular society was founded by a lady named Sarah Doremus, or at least maybe she filed the paperwork. But this idea of women's missionary societies, it seems to me, from a semi-ignorant perspective that I'm bringing to the table, there were multiple of these societies, right? This was not any one just denominational thing, and some were denominational, and some of them were just women that just by golly decided this is something we're going to do. So give us some
Yeah,
overview about that, if that's
yeah, wonderful.
cool to talk
So
about.
that first missionary society that was founded by Sarah Doremus was an interdenominational society. So
Okay.
just one denominational one. And she wasn't the first woman ever to found a missionary society, but she was the first American. So
Ah,
earlier over in England, there had been between 1834 and 1860, the Female Education Society, which has
hmm.
sent out 60, 90, somewhere in there, missionaries, women missionaries abroad. But Sarah Doremus was the first American. And then after her, you gave the date 1861. After her, all the way until the early 1900s, there were over 40 of these
Wow.
gender separate, because there's already missionary societies that exist, but they're run by men. And the societies at the time didn't actually want to send out single women as missionaries.
Mm,
That was just considered a little bit too risky. We don't know what's going to happen to these women. But it was women who were out on the field, who were married women, who were recognizing that they couldn't do it all, right? They're married, they have a husband, they have kids, they've got housework, and then they're supposed to also do mission work on top of this. And they were realizing, look, we can't do it all. But hey, who could? If there was a woman here who wasn't married, she'd have a lot more ability, a lot more time to be able to spend time spreading the gospel among other women. Because in some of these societies like India or China, you can't have men sharing the gospel with women.
ah,
That's completely unacceptable. And you also can't have male doctors treating female patients. That's also just unheard of.
right.
So these missionary wives are like, hey, there's so much mission work that we need to be doing. We don't have time to do it. Let's get some single women out here doing the work. And the male led mission boards are not willing to hire the single women. So that's why after Sarah Doremus founds this interdenominational society, basically then like every denomination gets on board. So
Ah,
like the Congregationalists, they're starting a foreign missionary society that will send single women to the field. And then you've got the Methodists, they're having one, the Baptists, everybody, up to 40 of these denominational and interdenominational missionary societies.
gee whiz. Well, I would assume that just like any other organizations and groups, some will make it, some won't make it. Some of them gave it the great try, but they ran out of money, or somebody ran out of time, or somebody died, or somebody, it didn't, and they maybe kind of merged together. I don't know if that happened, or did they?
Mm.
So would that be kind of those 40, how many would you guess today could have somewhere that they could trace back to one of
Yeah,
those 40 some odd?
that's a good question. I don't specifically know. So the interesting part of the story to me is not so much like what happens for the first 50 years, but actually what happens in the early 20th century is that woman missionary society after one after another ends up being dissolved, like
Mm,
completely destroyed. And so that's the piece of the story that I actually find really interesting and frankly pretty sad,
Hmm.
because what you see here is that these women start getting accused of siphoning funds away from the other male-led denominational boards.
The quote unquote more important ones,
Right.
or something like that, that in a
Exactly. So
in a male
that's
that
the
was
part of the
sweet work.
story. Oh,
That
that
was real sweet work y'all were doing, but
yeah,
it's time for the big boys, and we don't have enough money, so we can't
exactly.
do your little play project anymore. You're going to have to come over here and do what the big
Exactly.
boys say. Yeah.
And even though that accusation wasn't true, like, no, they were actually raising their own money and still contributing to the male-led boards. Like, that wasn't a true accusation, but it kind of caught on.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Plus, it was the time of the fundamentalist modernist controversy, early 20th century. And within that controversy, like different factions line up. And for the kind of more conservative faction, like women's work becomes seen as like too much of like a liberal feminist thing that we're opposing. And
Mm-hmm.
then for more of the liberal side of it, they're going to view women's missionary work and like family life work. They're going to say, oh, that's just too old fashioned. So it's
Mm-hmm.
so interesting.
Wow.
Like another part of the disillusion of these women's boards is related to that controversy. And when you have these two opposing poles, you know, the liberals, the conservatives, fundamentalists, modernists, women's work ends up being caught in the crossfire. This is
Oh,
one of the things my advisor, Dana Robert, would always make a big deal about. Like earlier on, like both sides were able to agree that women's work is this important thing that needs to be taking place. But by the time you get to these two different factions, women's work is one of the things that gets lost because it becomes this lightning rod for our disagreements. Like,
wow.
so that's the part of the history that I find just, again, like really sad, because these women were doing amazing work, like bringing the gospel to women in these cultures where like men didn't have access to women because that wasn't considered appropriate. Um, they were founding schools for women, like thousands of schools, including the first colleges for women in Asia. Um, and just doing really good work. And so what ends up happening as these in the early 20th century, when these mission gender separate mission societies are folding, like women's work just kind of like gets left behind, because
Mm.
again the male led boards are just sort of doing other work. They're not really focused on the women. So it's that period of 50 years where the women are doing this excellent work abroad, um, and are able to do it because they are running their own boards in order to do it.
Well, that's such a fascinating thought process. As I tell students all the time, Jesus didn't give the 12 apostles a three-ring binder and say, this is exactly the way you're going to run this thing, right? And so, how
Mm,
the church and how spreading the gospel and how discipleship and how it all kind of ebbs and flows and starts and stops, I think is one of the
yeah,
interesting stories of the history of Christianity and of the church is the greater part of the church, kind of what that ends up looking like. All right. So
yeah,
it's not all run into a nunnery, right? I mean,
right,
there's plenty of, so how did it happen in kind of just a practical way? I mean, if we're a group of women who decide we need to do this for whatever reason they decided, however they heard or thought or were informed about it or whatever it may be, and let's say we've raised our money, okay, the way that we've raised our money, what do I do with that money? How do I have to find as well somebody who's willing to go, who's
right,
probably a single, an unmarried woman? And then how do I figure out what boat to put them on? How do I know when they
right.
get to Burma or wherever they're going that they've got a place to, do work once they get there? That had to be incredibly
Yeah.
difficult to pull off.
Yeah, it's a neat story, just how these decisions get made, right? And one of the things I find so funny, frankly, is that early on, the only if you were a woman, the only way you could get to the mission field was by marrying a man who
Mm,
was going to become a missionary. Like that was the only way you could get there. Because, like I said before, the male led boards did not hire single women. So that's why it's such a significant thing when these female led boards realize we need to hire single women. But then it ends up being kind of a bummer if the woman you hired like goes and gets married when she's on the field. Like, you know, God forbid that she actually meets somebody out there she wants to get married, because now your excellent worker that you hired like has kids and housework and like can't go out and do the work, right? Um, but another thing I wanted to mention, like you said, okay, they have the money to be able to send these women to the field. But one of the fascinating things is how they get the money.
Yes, let's talk about that.
Because like the women's missionary societies were super innovative in this way, because what they would do is just publish these really small pamphlets, and no one had done this before. Like just these really small pamphlets with, you know, like a personal interest story in it. And they would just sell them for super cheap. And like,
Mm.
who wouldn't want to read, you know, just like this really moving story of, you know, some orphan that then we founded a school for girls and she can go and be like raised out of poverty and all this stuff. And so it doesn't cost very much to buy these little pamphlets and read these stories. But tons and tons of women buy these things. And so they're able to raise enough money just by having these
Wow.
small little drives. I'm trying to remember how many women were part of this, but it's
I
just
mean, was it something like you wrote off to P.O. Box, fill it, not P.O. Box,
right.
but whatever, 1225 Evanston, Illinois, and we'll send you back this, you know.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, we'll send you a brochure and then you're on the list, right? And now
Yeah.
they know
And
you're there and
it feel like, oh my goodness, my little 10 cents has contributed to helping this poor girl that was stuck in poverty. And now she's been educated by one of these schools that the women's missionary societies have started. I found my number. Yeah, 3 million women belonged to missionary societies. 3
wow.
million women. That's the most, like, out of any kind of voluntary society in America at the time. That's the largest, is women belonging to these missionary societies. And it's a way to just feel like, yeah, you're doing good work in the world. So they raise this money, and then they have to find the people to send. And another thing I find just really fascinating about this story is, so women weren't really seen as being capable of deep theological thought at the
Yeah,
time. But
yeah,
like these women's missionary societies, they are asking women tough theological questions. Like, tell
really.
me exactly how the atonement works. You know, describe the Trinity. Like, how does that make sense? Let's talk about justification, sanctification. And so these women, you know, that you got to be single, you got to pass your theology exam that you know these women are interviewing you at, and then you also have to be physically strong, right? So you have stories of people like they pass the exam, they're single, but they just are seen to be like too weak. They're going to get sick when they get to the field. Um, so yeah, it is a bit of a task to find someone who can pass in all of those ways, and then make sure she doesn't get married when she's out there, because then you lose your worker. Um, but yeah, that's a little
What
bit.
a fascinating piece. Hey, we're enjoying our conversation we're having about women's missionary societies with Dr. Anneke Stasson. Tell us, um, so denominationally, then, for those that did it from within a denomination, uh, uh, were those things often seen as local groups who kind of uh, went up, if you will, in the hierarchy of the denomination and said, "Hey, we want to do this. Is this okay?"
Mhm.
And we want the okay, or was it the other way? Were there other ways where folks would have said in that particular denomination, "We recognize that there needs to be a separate women's thing for any number of things, men interacting with women to share the gospel being my guess is
Yeah,
one
yeah,
of the things that they just knew, hey,
exactly.
we don't need to do that. Um, uh, did they kind of get started that way, or was it both?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it would usually be somebody home on furlough, so male or
Oh,
female home on
okay,
furlough.
okay,
So, like the
okay.
Methodists, Women's Foreign Missionary Society of the Methodist Episcopal Church, the
Yes,
WFMS, that
right.
became the largest of the women's missionary societies. But the case there is like these two missionary wives are home on furlough, and they're like, you got to help us. Like, what can we do? They're just having a little ladies meeting, and they're
Gotcha.
like, we know that there's such a need for education and healthcare and evangelism in India, where we come from, or in China, where we come from. And so that's how it starts. It's 1869, these women home on furlough from India. And that very group raises the money and hires two of the most significant missionaries in this whole history, Dr. Clara Swain and then Isabella Thoburn. Both of them
Mm,
were hired by the Methodists here. Clara Swain founded the first hospital for women in Asia,
really?
and then Isabella Thoburn founded the first women's college. So very first hospital, very first college for women, and it all happens just because these missionary wives are like, let's do something, right? So
Well, but they see the
very
reality of it,
grassroots.
right?
Yeah,
They're living with it, right? I mean, they're like, we're there. We know what we're talking about here. Here's
yep,
a problem, and it's not getting fixed, and we really need you folks to help us out.
yep, exactly. And so then it grows from there. And I think after those first couple of societies get started, then everybody else kind of wants to jump on the bandwagon, right? It's like, oh yeah, we should have our own women's missionary society. And it's not seen as like any kind of subversive thing. Like everybody realizes, yeah, this, like, we got to get the gospel out there. Like everybody knows that the mom in a family is super important to the development of like what her kids believe or even what her
Mm,
husband believes. And
right,
if our missionary societies as they currently exist are only reaching the men in India or China, like we're not going to convert very many people.
right.
Everybody, the men, the women, everybody at this time is recognizing the need for these societies.
Mm. Was it theological of why different denominations thought we just don't like the way the Methodists do it, and so
Mm,
we're going to kind of do it our thing, or we
that's
kind of,
yeah.
I mean, or we don't really, we
Right.
disagree maybe on this doctrinal issue, and I don't know, whatever it is it might be, or
Question. Because some of the women's missionary societies are interdenominational, but then, yeah, like they do all have their own women's missionary society. So I don't really totally know why.
yeah,
It might have just been more pragmatic, like just the channels that we have for getting there. Like these single women can go along with the married couple that are already going to our Baptist base in Burma. Um, what was I going to say? Oh, but the other thing to say about that is that actually those denominational differences didn't matter as much to the women.
uh,
So even though they did found these different denominational organizations, what they cared most about was helping women. Like the
hmm
tagline was woman's work for woman. Like they cared that women got educated and women were cared for medically. And that was more important to them than whether we're going to line up theologically exactly correct on like our view of the atonement. So the women were
sure,
just more willing, I think, to cross those denominational boundaries. That's one of the things that Dana Robert argues in her book on women in mission. It's just that the women weren't as tied to those. So, but it still is an important point that, well, they still did have their denominational differences. They just
right,
they just weren't as high in their estimation of what was most important.
right. So as some missionaries have told me before, look, if I'm 1,000 feet up in the air in the Andes, I'm not having arguments about
Right.
predestination with my neighbor
Right.
over here. We're both
Exactly.
trying to get a house built. We're trying to get water done. We're trying to get, we're trying to
Yep.
do whatever it is, we're pull teeth, whatever it is that we're doing, and we're not really arguing about that right
Right.
now. I mean,
Yeah.
and so it's much more of a practical thing about part of that.
Yes, exactly. And that's another thing that the women's missionary movement a word we should have as part of our conversation is holistic.
Hmm.
Missionary movement was holistic. So they are concerned with women's health, they're concerned with women's education, with women's spiritual identity. It just is, it's all of these pieces. And they recognize that there is a connection to a woman being able to follow Christ and like being physically healthy and having an education and being
Right,
able to like get out of a marriage that is abusive. And so there, I think holistic is a good way of thinking about the women's missionary movement, but holistic can convey both like good things and bad things, I guess you could say. So on the good side of it, like, yeah, Christ saves us. He saves us body and soul. And that is what these women are trying to bring abroad. But one of the criticisms of the women's missionary movement is that they were pushing Western culture more
Ah,
than
okay.
just the gospel. So women missionaries have been accused of being cultural imperialists. And
Hmm.
part of the reason for that is because they are holistic. They're telling you like, hey, let's change the way we do home life. Let's be more cleanly. Like let's wash our hands, let's dress ourselves this way because in their view like all of this, like how you dress, how you prepare for meals, what you believe, how you're educated, all of these things are important. But kind of one of the negatives here is that they didn't have the best ability of being able to separate out their religious beliefs from their cultural, just Americanness or Englishness.
Sure.
You know? So I guess that's another thing to say. Like some people look at the women's missionary movement and just see it through an imperialist lens, like they're just trying to spread Western culture.
I got you. So if it's
Yeah.
kind of like, um, we're reading too much Kipling or something, and we're trying
Yeah.
to we're trying to say, you know what? If these women dress this way and that's what's normal for them and their community, that is not going to do very well in Piccadilly Circus, okay, or is going to do
Yeah.
very well going down the streets of Charleston, South Carolina, where everybody's eyeballs would be, bugging out.
Right.
Don't, the criticism might be, don't tell them this is the only way they can do it. They've been doing it this way forever. No, you want to show them how to maybe, find some ways that can keep them healthier or get
Yeah.
them where they can be educated or they could be or learn more about the gospel. Hooray. But when you
Yeah.
start putting your kind of white Western world on the rest of these folks, that might be somewhere some of the criticism would,
Right.
but in retrospect, probably instead of in the midst of it, or do you think there was criticism going on while they were doing part of that?
Well, I mean, mostly what I'm pulling from is more contemporary scholars
Yeah, that
that
are
are
looking
looking
back.
back. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. And it's just an argument. And I mean, one of the classic arguments too is it's just kind of ironic that these Western women, who in many of these denominations didn't have certain rights, you know, like the argument is often made that they are advocating for rights for these women abroad that they don't even have for themselves. And that one of the ways that these American women are seeking to lift themselves up is
Mm.
by depicting themselves as the saviors of non-Western women.
Ah,
So that's just another one of these arguments that's made looking back. And I think there's certain truths to that. But I also just think like these women were doing amazing things that were super helpful for people abroad.
sure.
You go and you ask someone in Asia or Africa, like what their view of some of these people is. Often,
Hmm.
if you're talking to like a woman who knows the history, she's going to be like, oh my gosh, they started the first schools for me.
Yeah,
Like, that's okay. Yeah, they came with some like Western baggage. That's true. But also, I couldn't be educated until these women showed up. I couldn't be treated in a medical facility. I couldn't myself become a doctor or a nurse or a teacher until these women showed up and gave me the education to be
yeah,
able to do that.
yeah.
So I like to just,
Standing on their shoulders type of thing, right? I
yeah,
mean, had they not done that,
right.
what might have been that we're able to do
Yeah,
today, because in this society in which we lived, there was no way for me to do anything other than turn
exactly.
out more babies and cook more food. I mean,
Exactly. Yeah. So the first doctors in China are women that went through the missionary schools. These schools started for girls,
hmm,
right? And then like I love the story of these two women. Their American names are Mary Stone and Ida Kang, but their Chinese names are Shi Meiyu and Kang Cheng. But
okay,
they were like at University of Michigan Medical School in the late 1800s. These two Chinese girls. And then they go back and they're the first women in China to open up hospitals and dispensaries
wow,
and like nursing training schools. And then other girls in China see these women and they're like, I want to be a doctor. And it all started because these missionary women had their missionary societies there training up these women to be able to go and then start this. So I just think that's really cool. And even with the
Absolutely.
baggage, it's that's something to be celebrated.
Yeah. Well, when you put it on the net, any
Yeah.
negative and positive, the net positive far outweighs any potential or perceived negative, right? I mean, would be.
Yeah.
Did any of these women, did any of the reason that they kind of that they didn't last as long or within this 50-year time period that you're talking about, how much of it did women's suffrage come into part of that?
Mhm.
I mean, were
Right.
there other men that were like going, hey, we've had about all this, or did
Yeah.
their attention turn a different way, or was there
Yeah.
overlap? I mean, one of the things that we've discussed some on our podcast before is really where that line was between the women's
Yep.
temperance movement and the suffrage pieces, and some of them lined up and some of them did not line up, and Francis Willard's got to go this way because Moody says I'm not doing this with you because
Yep.
whatever. I mean, those type of things were all kind of getting messed up during this or overlapped maybe in some of that. Is there any of that that
Yeah, I think that's great that you're bringing that up because I think that's a big part of it. So none of these women that started these societies and went abroad as single women missionaries during the
hmm
late 1800s, none of them would have called themselves feminists. Like, no,
really?
no, that's not who we are. But the funny thing is like I would probably call them feminists because like my definition of feminism is just that you care about women and you want women to have the same opportunities as men.
Yeah,
Right. And so I look at these early missionaries and I'm like, you, even though you didn't want to call yourself that, like I would because you're founding the first schools for women. But the reason they didn't want to is because, yeah, increasingly as you get into the suffrage movement, they weren't women that were pushing for suffrage, the women that were going abroad and starting these societies. And so in their mind, like, no, the suffragettes, they're the feminists. We're doing
right,
something different, you know?
right,
So I
right.
think that is part of the reason too that those societies did start to suffer, especially as the suffrage movement builds steam there in the early 20th century,
hmm
because people then are kind of like nervous. If you aren't pro-feminist, pro-suffrage movement, then it makes you nervous to have these women-led missionary societies because like what are women doing in these societies? Like they're like, hey, should we send this woman to the field or not? Like they're voting on it. They're vetting these missionaries. They're
Really?
controlling the funds. They're like the women are doing everything in these organizations that kind of they don't do in any other position in American society at the time, like controlling funds, making mission strategy. Um, so, like, all of that becomes under scrutiny when these suffrage conversations are coming up because people are saying, like, oh, no, we want women to have this identity and not that identity.
Uh, yeah.
So, yeah, I think that's good that you brought that up.
It's a fascinating time period,
It
right? I
is.
mean, to kind of think about how, but this is happening in the UK as well as the US, right? I mean,
Right.
are there any other countries that you would say that really started to do some of this same type of work in their
Yeah.
own?
Well, I mean, even all the places where these Western missionaries are going, right? So parts of Africa, India, China, um, people in those locations then are founding their own gender separate mission organizations, like within country,
I got you.
right?
Okay,
And they're going to look a little different. They're going to maybe
sure.
focus on different things, but you have like in among the Methodists in South Africa and other parts of Africa, you have what are called mothers unions. And it's
Hmm.
just a bunch of these women that have become Christian and they form these mothers unions to do a lot of the same stuff that the missionaries are doing. Like, hey, let's take the gospel out to people that don't know the good news. Let's go out and try to like have these meetings with other mothers and talk about like hygiene and child rearing. And this is the same stuff the women's missionaries were doing, but now they're just doing it, themselves in the locale.
Yeah, kind of internal instead of external,
Yeah.
right? They're kind of an ingathering of their
Yeah.
own that they're pulling together to do. What about domestically? Did these societies do? outreach to Native Americans
Oh,
or
yeah.
to places where there were maybe, extreme poverty in urban and rural areas in the U.S. I mean, did they go there as
Yeah.
well?
That's a great point. Like the model for these societies actually came from in England, in the inner city, and they just wanted people to be able to go like door to door, kind of sharing the gospel.
Hmm.
And they realized like maybe the best people to go are like people that are kind of from that social class that we're trying to reach. So kind of lower socioeconomically. And so these women in churches in England founded these societies and employed people that they called Bible women.
Huh.
And these Bible women were people from, they were just like lower class women that knew other lower class women. And these more middle class women are like, hey, we'll pay you to like take the gospel door to door and like, again, take hygiene information, anything to improve the lives of, holistically of these
Sure.
and we just know you can reach them better than we can reach them because you kind of know them, the language to speak. And that became the model then for Bible women in Africa and Bible women in China. So the women missionary societies were like, we're here. We could be the one to go door to door, but like, the language. So how about I hire you? And
Right.
so they employed 5,700 Bible women, these missionary
Really?
societies. So like we kind of have to shift the way we're thinking about the women's missionary society. Like they're hiring, maybe they're supporting 300 Western missionaries, but 5,000 indigenous missionaries that are being paid as evangelists, women being
Sure.
paid as evangelists and like preaching, like African women preaching in the streets, Indian women, Chinese women, the first paid vocations in ministry are happening there on the ground through these women's missionary societies. So that's another piece of it I just think is so cool.
Yes, it's very fascinating to be able to see you know, when people are gifted with whatever it is that they are gifted to do, how can they turn that gift into what is something meaningful
Yeah.
and not allowing, other prejudices or stereotypes or, patronistic, anything else that's
Mhm.
keeping them from being able to do that. I think that's what that is something very interesting for us to know, and it
Mhm.
I'm glad to know that there's been good scholarship by folks like you
Yeah.
that have looked into all of those pieces. So thank
Yeah.
you for spending some time with us and talking about this. Tell us if we want to learn more about this, where
Yeah.
would you suggest we would be able to find some resources that we might be able to read or to study up on?
Yeah, wonderful. Well, thanks for having me. And, I've mentioned her a couple times, but my advisor was Dana Robert, and she
Hmm.
was the one who got this whole study of American women missionaries started with her book, American Women in Mission. But honestly, that's a very thick book. It's pretty scholarly. So
Right.
um, I took her ideas and kind of
Right.
expanded them, but also made them a little bit more accessible with a colleague of mine. So my colleague Leanne Zabinski and I wrote a book called Women in the Mission of the Church. It was published by Baker Academic back in 2021. And what
Hmm.
we're doing in that book, we have a chapter that I've drawn from for this talk on missionaries, but we're basically trying to argue the whole history of the church from the days of Jesus all the way up to the contemporary church. What have women done to contribute to the mission of the church, right?
Hmm.
So in that book, each chapter is looking at different roles that women have had so as to be able to articulate this perspective that women have always been involved in the mission of the church.
No
This is
doubt.
not a 21st century thing. Women
Right.
have been doing work to spread the gospel, the whole history, even if you don't necessarily read about them in most of your church history textbooks. That's why we wrote that book. So that's what I would recommend for people to get.
Fantastic. Well, We are so grateful for you to be able to join us and help us unpack and learn even more components and pieces about Christian history, which is what we do continually here. For those of you who are watching this video or checking us out, we hope that you will make sure to go back to our website at the centerforchristianhistory.com. Follow us on our social medias. Subscribe to our podcast and continue to join back and learn even more about this fascinating subject. So thank you so much. We appreciate it.
You're welcome. God bless you.